Hi everybody, this is Burke Holland and welcome back to HTML5 development for ASP.NET developers. Let's take a bit of a look at where we've come from and where we're going with this course. The first module that we went over was Hello Jquery, and we took a very basic introductory look at Jquery and how to use Jquery selectors to select items out of the document object model, and then how to use those items and manipulate their values. We talked a little bit also about Ajax in this module and how Jquery makes that pretty simple. In the next module, we talked about REST and JSON and ASP.NET Web API, and we looked at how to take data from a SQL server and expose that data using Web API in a very RESTful format, in a JSON serialized format as well, for the UI, for the web application to consume. And then we talked about HTML5, and we kind of tried to demystify that a little bit, talk about what HTML5 is and what it's not. And then we looked at the concept of polyfilling and using the modernizer library and using that to take something that would be broken in, say, IE6 and add that functionality back in by using a polyfill. So now we've built up and we've looked at Jquery, and then we've looked at the concept of services, and then we looked at HTML5. We're ready to move on and say hello to Kendo Ui. Now, Kendo UI is an HTML5 framework that contains everything that you need to build rich web, mobile, and data visualization. We break Kendo UI up into those three components. So let's take a quick look at those. The first one is Kendo Ui Web. In Kendo UI Web, you'll find things like the grid, the tree view, of course the calendar controls, sliders, things that you would find in a web application. Now, all of these web controls are fully optimized for touch and for mobile devices. However, they have more of a web look and feel to them. And we'll talk about the difference between the web and the mobile framework here in just a minute. The two can be used interchangeably. The next thing that we have is the data viz, what we call the data viz. And this is the rich interactive charting that's in Kendo UI. And it uses SVG, which is HTML5, and then it falls back to VML, which is vector markup language, which works great on older versions of IE. And then lastly, we have the Kendo Ui Mobile. And Kendo Ui Mobile provides that native look and feel for mobile devices. So when you're building an application and you want to have it look like it's a native iOS or Android or BlackBerry application, Kendo UI allows you to do that. And Kendo UI has a very unique adaptive rendering framework that will allow you to write one application and have that application display appropriately on the device where it's being run. So now we've talked about all of that and we have a good grasp of what Kendo UI is. Let's take a look at how we can begin building an application with Kendo UI. I'm going to focus in this module on Kendo UI Web, and the next tutorials to come we'll be focusing on the web portion. And we'll also look a bit at the core framework of Kendo UI, which is shared across all three modules. And that would include things like the data source, validation, model view, view model, things like that. So with that, let's go ahead and fire up Visual Studio and get started writing some code. Alright, I've got Visual Studio fired up here, and I'm actually working off of the Hello Services project. So I'm not going to start from scratch in creating a service, but I want to start here where we left off with Hello Services so we have some data exposed to use. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of a lot of these pages here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the About page here, and I'm going to delete the Master page, and I'm going to delete the Default page as well. And then I'm going to add a new page back to the application, and now just add a plain ASP.NET web form. And we'll call that default.aspx, and it will have no master page. Now that we've got the default page loaded, let's go ahead and increase the text size here. And if you remember from the Hello HTML5 module, you'll remember that everything after the HTML and the doc type is no longer necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and clear all of this out. There we go. That's unnecessary. And additionally, this XML namespace on the HTML tag is also unnecessary, so we could take that right out. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this form here. And if you're familiar with the way ASP.NET Web Forms works, there's a form on every page, and inside that form are controls. Those controls are server controls, and they are wired to events and objects in the code behind. And when you click a button or fire an action, the page posts back to itself. It goes through a life cycle on the back end. It takes the values from those controls, it modifies the database or does whatever you've defined in the events, and then sends the markup and data back to the page. And we have things like view state and all that. We're not going to be using any of that in this tutorial or the ones to come. We're going to be creating what is commonly referred to as a single page application. And so we won't be needing this form because we won't be posting back to the server. So I'm going to take this out. And because I've taken this out, technically I no longer need this tag at the top as well. So I can take that out too. Now at this point you might say to yourself, well, couldn't he just have used an HTML page? Absolutely, sure. That definitely would have been much cleaner than the way that I'm doing it here, but we're using a ASPX page because we are working with ASP.NET, and this is commonly the kind of page that we'll be using. So I'm also going to take out this run at server, and what we're left is with some bare bones HTML. Very simple, just what we need. And we'll just give this a title of Hello Kendo UI. And there we go. So I'll save this. The next thing that I want to do is I want to add Kendo UI to my project. And to do that, I'm going to install it off of NuGet. So I'll choose Add a Library Package Reference, and I'll go Online, and I'll do a search for Kendo UI. All right, and then we see Kendo UI comes up, Kendo Ui Web, and we'll go ahead and install this. All right, Kendo UI has been installed. I'll go ahead and close this out. Kendo takes a dependency on Jquery, so when it installs, it's going to put a Kendo folder in both content and scripts, and it will put Jquery here as well if it's not already installed in the project. So the first thing that we need to do to work with Kendo UI is to add the script files. And Kendo UI is going to need at least two script files. The first one will be the common script file, and this contains all of the CSS styles that are used in all of the themes. By default, when you install off of NuGet, you get all of the themes in Kendo UI. I'm going to use the default theme for this tutorial. Then the next thing that we'll need to do is add in the scripts. So the first thing that we'll add is Jquery, and I'm going to add the scripts at the bottom of the page. We'll add Jquery first here, and then I'll go ahead and remove the type. The browser will determine that this is JavaScript just by us not specifying the type. By default, it is JavaScript. That will work in every browser, so that's safe to use today. And then we'll go ahead and add in the Kendo JavaScript file. We could add in the specific components, but I'm just going to add in all of Kendo UI here. Normally you would just include what you need so you can save bandwidth and only send down exactly what's required. So now that we have these two script files included, below them I'm going to open up a new script tag, and this is where we'll write all the JavaScript code in the page. We want to go ahead and create a Kendo UI grid. The grid is the most complex widget really in the Kendo UI suite, and it's going to be used quite a bit in your Kendo UI development, so it's important to get a really solid understanding of the grid. To create a grid, we're going to need an empty div, and we can just give this div an ID of employees grid. There we go. And Visual Studio will close that tag for us. Inside of the script block here, I'm going to go ahead and create a document ready function. There we go. Now, because we included the scripts last in the body, we should have the whole page loaded by the time we get here anyway, but it's not going to hurt to wrap in a document ready function. And here I'll go ahead and select the employees grid like this, and we'll call the Kendo grid function. And you can see that there's some nice IntelliSense included now in this release of Kendo UI in Visual Studio, which should help quite a bit. So inside of the grid, we need to give it a little bit of information. We need to tell it that the data source is going to be a new Kendo data source. And inside of this data source, we'll need to specify the bare minimum, which is the transport. And the transport is where the data source will read the data from. And we'll say that when you read on the data source, it should read the API/employees endpoint. The transport also supports create, update, and delete, and you would specify those here as well, and we'll do that in the future. So if I close off the transport and then close off the data source and then the grid as well and add a semicolon, it should bring everything in line, and it does. Great. So we'll go ahead and save this, and let's fire up the application and have a look at what we've got so far. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that I'm now using Google Chrome, and the reason for this is the Chrome developer tools are really outstanding. And as you develop a single page application, you're going to want to have a very robust developer tool set in your browser, and Chrome makes this much easier. Now, you will want to test, of course, on the target browser that you're deploying to. The good thing is that if you're using Kendo UI, you can be assured that it will be working all the way back to IE 7, so that when you go to test, it should be working there as well. The next thing you'll notice is that this grid, while it has data in it, is not really what we want. The ID columns in the middle, the first name and last name headings do not have a space. We'd like to clean that up a bit. So let's specify some columns in the grid. Here at the top of the grid, I'm just going to specify the columns. So the columns object is an array, and it takes objects, one object per column that you want to specify. So we'll say that we want to take the first name field, and we want to display that with the title of first name, and then we'll do something similar for the last name. We'll say that the field is going to be last name. That's the field of data to display, and we want the title to be last name. And we'll leave the ID out altogether, as that's really internal database information that we don't need to expose to the user. So we'll go ahead and add a comma here. There we go. And save this, and we should be able to jump back over to the application and see our grid now reflecting these changes. So refresh this page, and you can see that the grid now displays just the first name and the last name, and the ID column is completely gone. Now at this point, we can do some pretty interesting things here with the grid. We could say that it's groupable, if I could spell it right, there we go, and that it's sortable. Set that to true as well. If we just do this and nothing else, jump back over and refresh, you'll see that the grid now has sorting in it, and it has drag and drop grouping by column header. So we can sort here, and then we can drag and group by column. This is all well and good. It works great, but let's assume that our data set, instead of having 10 rows, has several thousand. In which case, instead of doing this on the client side, as Kendo UI is doing it now, we'll want to do this on the server. So let's take a look at how we might do some of these actions on the server. A primary candidate for this is paging. Paging is quite popular and common in grids, and if you have a very large record set, you're going to want to do the paging on the server, as databases are very, very good at paging through data instead of putting all of that data in the browser and asking the browser to do that. So in order to enable paging in this grid, what we'll do is I'll set pageable to true in the grid, and then on the data source, I need to tell the data source how many records to display per page. Now normally you might do 10 or 20. I'm going to do 3 because there's only 10 records in my data source that we're pretending are actually thousands. We'll add a comma here and save this. Now if I save this and I go back over to the browser and refresh, you'll notice that we now have paging in groups of 3, and I can page through this. This is nice. This is still happening client side though. If I come back and I tell the data source that I want to do my paging on the server, I just say server paging is true. Now by setting this simple flag, what will happen is Kendo UI will expect the server to do the paging. And you can see that it's displaying all of the records, and that's because the server, it's expecting the server to send back only what's needed for the current page of data. So let's go ahead and look at how we can push this back to the server and have the server send the data instead of the client. The first thing that we're going to need to look at is the parameters that Kendo UI is actually sending to the server. To do that, I'm going to open the developer tools in Chrome here. Tools, Developer Tools. And in the Developer Tools, if I do a refresh, we can look at the request that's going back to the employees. Let me maximize this here, and we'll expand this just a little bit. And you can see that the request is now sending some parameters back. A take parameter, skip, the current page, and the page size. Take is how many records we want the database to fetch. Skip is how many records to skip, and the page is the current page that we're on, and then the page size is really the same as the take. So we need to actually extract those parameters in the server-side code, apply those to our query, and only send back the requested amount of data. So if I go back here and I stop, I'll come up and let's go to the employees controller. And in order to get these parameters, we're going to need to look at the HTTP request. So we can create an HTTP request here, and we'll call it request. And I'm going to give it an underscore because it's at the top. And then we'll set this equal to the current context and the request. So every time that this controller is loaded, this underscore request object will represent the current HTTP request. Now here, what we want to do is create a couple of variables. And the first one is a take parameter, and the second one is a skip parameter. And the take parameter we're going to set equal to, and we're going to look at the request and the take parameter. And if this request.take parameter is equal to null, then we want to go ahead and set that the default is 10. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and parse the incoming string into an integer. So if we don't pass a variable to this take here, if there's no take parameter on the query string, we'll get a 10. Otherwise, we're going to read this variable off of the request object, this take parameter. We'll do the same exact thing with skip. In fact, I'm going to copy this down nearly verbatim. Then we'll go ahead and just change this to skip. And we'll change this to skip here as well. And then by default, we want to skip 0 records instead of 10. So there we go. Now if we jump back down to the link query here, we just need to apply this skip and take. And luckily for us, link makes this very easy as it has these functions built in. So if I wrap this here, this from, and close it down here, I can say that we want to skip. We want to do skip first because we're going to be skipping a certain amount of records. So we're going to skip the skip, and then we'll take however many is in our take variable here. So let's go ahead and save this, and we'll restart the application. We'll get a new tab, so we'll close the first one. And you can see that we're now sending back 3 records instead of all 10. But we are not getting all of our pages of data. We're only getting 1 page. Why is that? Well, the reason for this is that we have not provided Kendo UI with an essential piece of data, and that is how many total pages are we working with here. In order to do that, we're going to need to modify the response some. So let's go ahead and stop the application and open up the employees controller. I'm going to jump down to the models folder and add in a new model object. I'm going to add a class, and I'm going to call it response. And what I'm doing is creating a generic response, and I'll increase the font size here. A generic response that will send back with all requests. So in this response, I really want 2 properties. The first property that I want is going to be a collection of whatever items I'm sending back. Currently, we only have employees going back, but we could have customers, orders, any sort of thing. This is a generic wrapper for the response. So I'm going to make this of type array, and we'll just call it data. Now, if array sends off alarms in your head and you're thinking that's not type safe, that's not right, then that's totally normal. And in C# and VB.NET, normally we wouldn't do this. We would use a generic that is a type safe collection. But since this is going to end up as an array anyway, when it gets to JavaScript, we're totally fine doing this here. The other thing that we're going to need is the count. So we'll just create a parameter called count and make that an integer. I'm also going to create a constructor here, which will allow me to build this object by passing the values in. So we'll pass in an array of data, and we'll pass in a count integer. And then I will set the properties equal to the values that are coming in to the constructor. There we go. And we'll go ahead and save this. And then we need to modify the employees controller to return a response object instead of a list of employee objects. So we'll say response. And then here I want to go ahead and cast this to an array, which we can do just nicely there. And then I'm going to return a new models response, and then I will just pass in the employees, and then I can get the count of the total number of records by looking at the link to SQL employees object and the count convenience method. So go ahead and close that off like that. Now if we save this and run this application, let's take a look at what we've got so far. you'll notice that the grid is empty. And there's a good reason for this. If we look at the network requests, and I'll refresh so we can capture some, and let's look at the employees request, you'll see that the schema of the data has changed. The collection of employees is no longer the top level main element. Now we have data, and if you scroll to the end, you'll see the count. So what we want to do now is explain to the data source what our new schema looks like. To do that, we'll just jump over and we will actually do that in the data source schema. So I'm going to here after server paging, just going to define the schema on the data source. And it needs to know where is the data. And for us, we call that data. And the total amount of data we put in a variable called count. By doing this, we have explained to the data source what our JSON response now looks like. So if I save this and I come back over and refresh this page, you'll see that we're now getting records back, and as we page through them, if you watch the lower pane, the dev tools, you can see the responses going back to the server. And you see a little spinner shows up there very quickly. If I come back here and I simulate a little bit of latency, normally you would never do this in a production application, but we can simulate some latency here by causing the thread to sleep for say 1 second. There we go. And then we'll go ahead and run this. And we'll have a look. When the grid actually comes up, we've got some simulated latency. So the grid is loading, and then as we page through, we get a spinner as Kendo UI takes care of informing the user that there is an action going on behind the scenes. So that takes care of this module of Hello Kendo UI. From here, we'll build out, use a lot more of the Kendo UI core framework, use a lot more widgets, create a very robust single-page application using some real business data. So that's all for now, and I'll see you next time.